Good day, fellow scapers. My name's Deck, but please call me Hobo, and welcome back to my channel. So as I've been working on my log currently for Zuck, I began thinking about what a fantastic boss he is, how much fun I've had at bosses like him, Parapack, Archglacier. I've even been tempted by Croesus a few times as well, and it also got me thinking about how the Elder God Wars stacks up now, 2-year-old content, how it stacks up now against bosses like Vorkath, Raziel, Zamorak, and basically the impact of the enjoyment factor that I've had from each of the newer bosses against some of the older bosses, and generally their impact to the game. So as we know, the bosses that have been released most recently have been Vorkath, Raziel, and Zamorak. And let's be honest, Vorkath was a flop on release, but why was this? What made Vorkath less engaging than bosses that are arguably both harder and easier depending on where you go and who you speak to? You might be thinking it's the drops, or lack thereof. In truth, you'd be partly right. The drops from Vorkath have been pretty abysmal from the offset, something that Jagex are hopefully looking to fix, and have already made some headway in doing so by releasing the new Vorkath scale in hard mode, as well as refining the visuals and the technical gameplay around the battle. But still to this day, it has not interested me once in being a boss I want to learn. For the amount of effort to learn to get the drops that they're just not good enough for me to learn. Instead, I'm far more likely to buy the armor, and I've already bought the Invoke Death Codex. Lucky for me, I'm not an iron.
Post-editing Deck here. If this is the kind of content that you like to see around Runescape 3, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel, as this kind of thing really does help with the algorithm, and it lets YouTube know that you want to see more stuff like this on your feed. But that's it.
Now, Raziel for me is a tough one. I've farmed Raziel over 2,000 times. I've got the log several times over at this point. And on top of this, Raziel has netted me billions in the process due to how lucrative combating him is per hour. Even now, if you kill Raziel more than 30 times an hour, you'll be looking at netting north of 100 million GP per hour. So what's wrong with him? The fight is just plain boring. It's incredibly easy to get burnt out. For people familiar with Raziel and have tried to push for GP per hour, the fight lasts between 1 to 2 minutes, and it's just not that enjoyable. The problem, and I think the only thing that drives people to fight him, is the amount of GP that you're able to earn per hour. It baffles me a little bit as to how Jagex could have easily made bosses like Vorkath a million times more relevant by having it so that Raziel drops the weapons and Vorkath can drop the armor. And also at the time, it could have been armor that's reforged for the other 3 combat styles as well, which would have had a massive impact across the board. Yes, people would have still been using the other styles, and Jagex have really pushed for people to engage with Necromancy. However, I think that tier 95 drop weapons from Raziel would have easily kept people coming back to him time and time again. It would have also meant that there was a greater stretch for content and drop releases during the season of Necromancy. And that ideally people wouldn't have immediately called Necromancy overpowered and called for its immediate nerfing. In short, the boss is just too repetitive, and the only reason people farm him, in my opinion, is for the GP. Things that would have made him much better would have been to have slowed down the fight, prevent him from being a DPS dummy, in short, and just allowing people who potentially aren't as good at DPS to really, have the opportunity to take on the fight with Raziel. They could have reduced some of his damage, rendered him invulnerable for a certain period of time, and forced you to take on things like his minions as well as the pillars. This would have meant that people who are not quite as good at PVMing as the people who can do Raziel in a minute or so, it would have meant that they have more of an opportunity to do so. The next boss is, of course, Zamorak. Now, I would like to say Zamorak is going to be a boss that will last for a very long time in terms of how much interest there is, and I think Jagex have done an absolutely incredible job with this boss in terms of keeping it relevant for scaling with group PVM, for scaling Enrage, as well as solo players like myself. The rewards are engaging at all levels of Enrage, and the equipment is going to be relevant for a very long time for endgame PVMers. And the battle, whilst not necessarily straightforward, is easy to understand in terms of theory, even for noobs like myself. So why haven't I looked to complete his log? Well, it's a mixture of things, but primarily for me, I just didn't like his mechanics. I did start to get into Zamorak for quite a while, and I began to really enjoy him, but that was when Animate Dead and the Fractured Staff of Armadil were still a power pair. But when the nerfs hit, I just didn't enjoy him as much. as I once did. It took me a long time to get into him, as the requirements for the initial fight being the dungeon run just weren't of interest to me. and the nerfs hit shortly after. So let's bow our heads and take a moment of silence for our fallen combat duo. So it's 2024, and the content that I'm doing, it's more than 2 years old, and I've enjoyed it way more than the content released in the years after. And the question is why? Well, in part, it's because I'm a little bit of a rare drop addict. In part, it's to do with the beautiful scenery and arenas that surround each of the bosses. It's also it's also to do with how well they've future-proofed each of these bosses, perhaps without even realizing it. So first up on the chopping board is RuneScape's Groot. This boss, whilst not having been of a huge amount of interest to me, being predominantly a solo player, found huge success due to its appeal to skillers and killers alike. The drops were amazing, the area surrounding Croesus was absolutely fantastic, but several things that I think made this torso a little less relevant than the others in Elder God Wars is the fact it requires a group. I think Jagex really missed the trick on this, and had they allowed this to be a boss that scales to solo, it would have been a massive, massive hit, particularly if they had made it similar to the Archgrace, or in that you could select mechanics that you wanted to deal with. They really could have made this a boss for the ages, which has good drops. They could have also made it so that the experience rates were best in class and that they were game-changing for skillers. And it also meant that skillers naturally found themselves starting to get into PVM without really starting to get into PVM. Unfortunately, Croesus was also run afoul with the issue that Jagex nerfed Animate Dead, which makes the armor drop slightly less appealing, where people would rather sacrifice a little bit of protection for a lot more DPS. After all, a good offense is the best defense. Next up is the Archglacier. Now, this Icy Brute has scaling mechanics which are both optional, which means that you can also AFK him or climb in rage to take on a much higher and a bigger challenge. The rewards as they stand for melee are very, very relevant, and I would imagine this will be even more so when the beta has concluded. On top of this, the boss has been designed in such a way to bring individuals who may be new to bossing, gradually assisting in teaching them movement, defensives, AoE, and basic DPS rotations. Not only that, but the boss offers supplies to which many people, particularly me at this time, are extremely important. It addresses many issues with things like summoning and the lack of charms, as well as crafting supplies and keys. And even as I write the script for this, I'm farming Archglacier in the background for those lovely, lovely blues. This boss really does have almost everything, which is why I think it's a very well thought out boss, and it really is a shame that the thought behind Croesus wasn't quite as good. Moving on, next up is Kerapac, and the question is, why won't we let him die? And I suppose the answer is because we want to farm him for that beautiful bit of wood in his hands. The Fractured Staff of Armadillo, whilst having seen a decline in the desire to handle it, is still one of the most powerful weapons to ever grace the game. On release, it practically dismantled the need for Fortic auto attack, and for people who didn't want to go full sweat, it was amazing. The power in the staff was second to none, and for me it was such a massive part in helping me improve at PVM. The boss also had a consistent rotation in mechanics, which meant it was a boss that once you were comfortable with the mechanics, you could farm with the same rotation over and over again, and it would still be a boss that you would have to focus on to ensure that you didn't mess up and find yourself staying in Death's Office. The fight at the end got your heart racing, and when you saw that golden GP drop, it really was time to celebrate. This boss will forever be one of my favourites, even if the staff is no longer something worth farming. Last up is my latest project, Zuck. Now, Zuck is a funny one. Pre-Necromancy, I probably wouldn't have bothered with him, not because the boss battle itself is tough, but because of the endless waves to get there. I didn't enjoy the fight caves, the kiln, or the cauldron, and that really hasn't changed that much. However, with the AoE potential from Necromancy, it meant that I could blitz through these waves in about 10 minutes to get to a boss that is really something special. His drops are actually worth a dime. They're relevant if only for the books, as the weapon was basically a spec on release. The scenery is also beautiful, and overall has become one of my favourite things to do. Hard mode is a little bit weird for me. The mobs seem somewhat overpowered compared to what I would consider good hard mode content, but that is a very, very personal opinion, and people are free to disagree with it. So what makes Elder God Wars significantly better content for me? I've got to say it's everything. Of course, the drops trump Volcath by a country mile. The fights are more engaging than Raziel, and the drops are far more balanced, and the arenas are just plain nicer than with Zamorak. I think Jagex would do well to learn what it is that will help the community grow in PVM and future-proof it by further taking on lessons from the Elder God Wars. For me, I see myself staying a little while longer in the God Wars dungeon, and in the meantime, I hope Volcath gets some more love in terms of balancing for drops and for gameplay. As for Zami and Raziel, it's too late for you guys. Godspeed. But that's it for this Fool's Thoughts. Like I said earlier in the video, if this is content you enjoy, please consider subscribing and liking and leaving a comment on your thoughts, and maybe again catch me in my next RuneScape misadventure. Happy scaping.